chase on me, no chase on me, no chase on me, no chase.
It was essentially a war between my editors and myself because I wouldn't apologize for the story or back away from the story, and fought them on it publicly.
In 1988, he was recruited by the San Jose Mercury News, who was looking for an investigative reporter. He was assigned to the Sacramento Bureau, where he was allowed to choose most of his own stories. Around this time, Gary started getting big, and things was looking up for him. Now he was about to get stuff popping.
Investigative reporting is being sort of squeezed out of the picture, and I think intentionally, because it tends to ruffle feathers. I mean, good investigative reporting does ruffle feathers, and it draws lawsuits, and it gets newspapers and journalists. I've been an investigative journalist for about 25 years for daily newspapers, and in 1996 I wrote a series of stories entitled Dark Alliance, which was about CIA involvement in drug trafficking. What my story showed was that the cocaine that was being sold in those neighborhoods was coming from mainly one source, and this one source was being used to finance a guerrilla war in Central America. The general idea of the CIA dealing drugs was something that the American mainstream press had never written about before, and that's why it prompted outrage among blacks, among drug reform activists, among politicians, by the CIA, by every federal agency involved in the drug war, because it showed they weren't doing their jobs, that it was a fraud.
Gary began researching Dark Alliance in July of 1995. The series was published in the Mercury News in 3 parts from Sunday, August 18th, 1996 to August 20th. A long article and 1 or 2 short articles appearing each day. It was also posted on the Mercury News website with additional information, including documents cited in the series and audio recordings of people quoted in the articles. Now, before this even continues, because it gets pretty heavy, make sure that you go back and watch the videos made on the war on drugs. Go to the playlist and please watch the parts on the war on drugs. What about mass incarceration?
Message.
What about the crack era?
Message.
The war on drugs?
Message.
Make sure you go back and watch those videos. Nobody pushed the opioid crisis on the white community.
Message.
During the crack era, crack was pushed on us and they took the jobs.
Message.
On top of that, when you talk about mass incarceration, laws were passed that completely eliminated any type of judge's discretion. I mean, there's tons of things to name. The initial artwork of the series was a silhouette of a man smoking a crack pipe over the CIA seal. This artwork sparked way too much controversy, so they then removed it. His series reported that in addition to waging a proxy war for the U.S. government against Nicaragua's revolutionary Sandinista government in the 1980s, elements of the CIA-backed Contra rebels were also involved in trafficking cocaine to the U.S. in order to fund their counter-revolutionary campaign.
Just where did all that crack cocaine come from? How did it end up in the streets in the first place? Well, those are exactly the kind of questions that will have the nearest CIA agent shuffling awkwardly in their chair. To uncover the connection between the CIA and the crack that flooded U.S. cities in the 80s, we need to look away from the streets of LA or Miami and instead just head on over to the jungles of Central America. Just a year before the 1980 election that saw Ronald Reagan assume power, the dictatorial government of Nicaragua was overthrown. Huh? What does that have to do with the situation in America in the 80s? Well, as it turns out, everything. When Reagan became president following the 1980 election, he began quietly sending aid to the Contras through the CIA to assist them in fighting against the Sandinista government. As part of their Cold War efforts against the Soviet Union, money and weapons were provided to the Contras by the CIA, enabling them to conduct a brutal paramilitary campaign against the Sandinista government. Almost just as sickening was that Ronald Reagan himself described these right-wing extremists as freedom fighters and claimed that cutting off support to the Contras would allow the USSR to influence Central America. But of course, this didn't stop the CIA from backing the Contras. It just meant that they were forced to get creative, to really think outside the box for new ways to channel funding to the extremist paramilitary group. And what's a good way to make a lot of money? Cocaine. Most of the cocaine entering the United States was illegally imported from Colombia. But the rise in the use of crack cocaine across American cities became a seemingly instant, infinite money hack for organized crime groups, even those backed by the CIA. So it didn't take long for the order to come through from the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Let's smuggle some drugs to get some cash for our operations in Nicaragua. By omitting any requirement for the CIA to report narcotics violations, the U.S. had provided cover for its agents to potentially become embroiled in the thriving drug business that was growing in Central America. It might not have been endorsed behavior by anyone within the United States government, but it seems odd that not only was it not allowed, but the CIA also just so happened to have indirect ties to one of Nicaragua's very own drug smugglers. Were CIA agents physically handing out crack on the street corners? No, probably not. Were they aware that people they were connected with in Central America had some level of involvement in drug smuggling? Yes, at the very least, it was alleged that certain Contra members worked with known drug traffickers. So, did the CIA's agents have an obligation to report those narcotic offenses that they witnessed in the field? No, thanks to the Attorney General's letter, they didn't. And did the CIA work with and even protect major drug traffickers taking part in the importing of crack to the U.S.? Yes, that much is indisputable.
The secret flow of drugs and money, Gary reported, had a direct link to the subsequent explosion of crack cocaine abuse that had devastated California's most vulnerable black communities. Some had said conspiracy, some said good investigative work. Dark Alliance spread through extensive talk radio coverage and global availability through the internet, which at that time was only a small way to promote the news. Due to widespread coverage of this, led to many Americans feeling like the CIA was 100% responsible or at least complicit in the crack epidemic. And in more extreme coverage, they were talking about how the consistent strategy was strategic in the government's design to destroy black communities. Everything has been documented, and there has been admissions on the side of the government. The series was widely discussed on black talk radio stations, on some days attracting more than 1 million readers to the newspaper's website. Gary Webb later remarked, "You don't have to be the New York Times or the Washington Post to bust a national story anymore." Speaking of papers like the New York Times and the Post, they spent a lot of time trying to poke holes into the story rather than following up on it. And the Los Angeles Times was aggressive in their approach. The California paper assigned about 17 reporters to pick apart everything Gary Webb was trying to report. One of the 17 referred to it as the Get Gary Webb team.
It's hard to do these kinds of stories. They're very difficult because of the reporting that's required, the going into the field, dealing with often unsavory characters, dealing with secret government sources. And to do all that work and then have the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times attack you and try to destroy your life, there's a special pain in that.
Good. You know, the more important question is, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm alive. I'm here, you know, and not working for that newspaper anymore, thank God.
Well, tell us exactly what happened.
Well, what happened was, you know, like you said, they transferred me out to the boondocks, And I went on a byline strike, and I wouldn't allow my name to be used on any stories while I was out there. And, you know, that made everybody even madder. And then, I finally had to sit down and figure out, you know, this year and a half now since the series came out, and, you know, what am I doing with my life and what am I doing with my work that's meaningful? And I had to answer that, you know, nothing was happening. You know, it was clear to me that the Mercury, I mean, they had told me that, you know, even when we won the arbitrations, they weren't going to let me do anything worthwhile. They were not going to let me do any investigative reporting. So I had to figure, you know, this is kind of pointless to hang around and work for a newspaper whose, you know, editors you didn't respect and do dog bite stories for the rest of my life. It just didn't seem worthwhile.
That was Gary Webb speaking on Democracy Now! In December 1997. He would ultimately commit suicide.